My recent video hinged very much on Matthew Franklin Whittier's authorship and use of the star signature. And I mentioned in that video that I would have to sit down with someone and visit with them for a week in order to show them maybe 100 different pieces to convince them that Matthew was in fact the author using that signature. However, I neglected to mention one thing, and I'm going to try to keep this very short, and that is that Matthew did leave posterity a clue in code, a message in code that he was the author, as he did with a number of these attribution questions. So I can't go into all the proof, but I can show you a little bit of the evidence here, and I can show you the piece in which Matthew gave us that code and that message. Of course, it's not signed, so we have to affirm that that is in fact Matthew writing this unsigned piece in which the code appears. So again, I can't go back and back and back and back because that's what it would take. But this, we're talking 1855, and this is the 1855 Portland Transcript. It's a volume in beautiful condition. And there's two pieces we need to look at, and we need to give a little bit of background. In 1852, Matthew had moved back to Portland, Maine, where he was supporting his second ex-wife. His second wife was an arranged marriage. It was a very unfortunate arranged marriage. He couldn't live with her, but he had been supporting her and the three children ultimately from New York City and other places as he was traveling as a postal inspector, and as he worked in New York City and also in the summers in New Orleans, he would send money home. But he couldn't live with her. But he did move back to Portland in 1855, I think, to help raise his third child, a daughter named Alice, or Allie, because the first two were kind of mixed up and confused, and he wanted the third one to have the advantage of his presence and his influence. And she did turn out better, I think, in the sense that she had a happy marriage. Her grave is, and her husband's, they have a joint grave, and it's not very far from here, about 5 minutes drive. So Matthew was living in Portland, but around 1855, it appears that he bought a farm. And he was kind of a gentleman farmer. He wasn't a real farmer. He'd been raised on a farm in Haverhill, Massachusetts, but here he just bought kind of, a house with a plot of land, and he did a little farming and kind of made a big deal of it. He would write from that farm as though he was a farmer, and he would write about poetry, and he sounded like a retired farmer who for some reason was extremely knowledgeable about literature. And he would write, for example, under the pseudonym or the initial B, which I think stood for Bertram, which was the main character, the narrator of the poem Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which was really his poem, plagiarized by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. You can see how far back these things go. See, now I would have to prove that in order to prove B. B also talks about Edgar Allan Poe, having seen him recite The Raven in Boston in 1845. And there's some pretty strong hints in there about what he thinks about Edgar Allan Poe. I've gone over that before. So there's all these branches, see. That's why it would take a whole week of sitting down with somebody to show them 100 pieces. But we're just going to look at two. So in the October, let's see what this is. I have to go back and look at the date. The October 13, 1855 edition of the Portland Transcript, we have someone writing from the country who clearly knows the editors. And he has just bought a place, apparently, or recently bought a place in the country. And it's not clear when Matthew actually moved to this place, or whether he stayed, all the time, or whether he was just there for weekends to bring his daughter Allie there, or exactly what the arrangement was. But he may have been renting or, renting various places or something, and then at this point bought the farm. It's not clear. But anyway, because Matthew would fudge with these letter writing identities, he would assume a character for each letter writing person, and it was not quite true to life. And part of that was because he did not want to be identified for various reasons, which we won't go into. So it has to do with his anti-slavery work and so on. He did not want to be identified. He also did not want his pro-slavery enemies to know where his family lived when he was somewhere else. See, this is called A Letter from the Country. It's written to the editors, and again, it's very familiar It's clear that he knows them personally. He is inviting them to visit him. He talks about his yield as a farmer, which of course he's just joking about because it's just a house with a garden plot probably. The people out in the country, they say they have a garden and it's 40 acres, so who knows? To me, growing up in Miami in a subdivision, a garden is, a garden. But anyway, he goes on like that in a very kind of conversational tone. And then he gets to the real meat of the thing, the reason that he wrote. And what he's doing is referring back to a piece that he submitted for, I think it was the week before, for the October 6th, 1855 edition as Ethan Spike. Now, historians all agree that Matthew was the author of Ethan Spike, so there's no question that this is him, but he had not been outed yet. He was outed in 1857. Nobody knew that Matthew was the writer of Ethan Spike in 1855. It's important to keep that in mind. Also, Matthew had recently published an anti-slavery book, a novel called The Ragpicker or Bound and Free, and that is presumably why he was able to buy the farm. So all these things tie in. Now, this letter from Ethan Spike is my absolute favorite. He talks about a lecturer who comes to give a lecture at a lyceum about astronomy, and he doesn't know what he's talking about, and the preacher doesn't know what he's talking about, and they kind of get into it, So he talks about these lectures, and then he talks about the upcoming lectures that that are going to be given for this lyceum in his little town of Hornby, which is a fictional town. Anyway, he talks about himself as a wild comic. And of course, he means comet. He's spelling it wrong, but he actually means that he, in fact, is a wild comic. You see, so that's the kind of double entendre that's going on there. So when he refers to the wild comic, he means himself. Now that's important because he's going to refer to this and sign as a comet, see, in this next piece, which means that he's signing as himself, as the wild comet or comic. Now, in this letter from the country, we get down to the last paragraph. He writes, "By the way, can't you reckon me a, quote, special correspondent? Suppose you should allow me a corner in your editorial columns. To distinguish me from yourselves, you may give me some sort of a signature. A star, an asterisk, would do, but that would be rather too ambitious for a green hand." He's pretending to be, a farmer who's just starting to write. So even though he was a child prodigy. Besides being appropriated by a distinguished correspondent of a certain New York paper. Now, the history of the star is that Matthew started using it back in 1829. One or two other people might occasionally have used it, but basically it was one of his go-to signatures that he reached down into his grab bag and used periodically since 1829. I just showed you one from 1831, I think it was, or 1832. So what he's doing is referring not to Margaret Fuller. This is 1855. Margaret Fuller died in 1850. He's referring to Henry Ward Beecher because Margaret Fuller took the star, which was not her signature and not her work. When she went overseas as the foreign correspondent for the New York Tribune, she kept right on using it. And as I said, Matthew also kept right on using it in other newspapers as he had for many years. But when she died in a tragic seafaring accident off the coast of New York, Henry Ward Beecher picked it right up, like immediately, like a week or two after she died. He starts picking up the signature, writing in the New York Independent. And he writes a series of letters, signing with the star, and ultimately they get published as the Star Papers. Well, that's what he's referring to, because Henry Ward Beecher has now just published the Star Papers in book form. And Matthew can't leave this alone. He has to mention it. So that's what he means when he says that the star has been appropriated. And notice the word appropriated. He didn't say used. He meant it's been stolen. That's why he used the word appropriated. So he says that the star signature has been appropriated by a distinguished correspondent of a certain New York paper. Well, that's Henry Ward Beecher. So he says, perhaps it would be quite as suitable to mark my wandering paragraphs by the sign of that other class of heavenly bodies, known in the communication of your other correspondent, meaning himself, the Honorable Ethan Spike Esquire as comics. And he spells it that way, comics. I shall venture thus to sign myself, distinctly endeavoring in all future flights not to obscure the star, asterisk, that shines over the Berkshire Hills. And I guess that must be a reference to Henry Ward Beecher. And here is a big comet symbol underneath. Well, it's the only time he ever used it. It's not like he continued a column with that. It's all for the purpose of addressing Henry Ward Beecher's appropriation of his star signature, which came immediately after Margaret Fuller's appropriation of his star signature, and he'd had it up to here. So he wanted to tell posterity, that the star is his and Ethan Spike is his, neither of which were publicly known at this time in 1855. So that's Matthew telling us that he was, in fact, the star. Again, there's a whole lot of depth to that. In order to prove that, you have to prove the other thing, like B, that was B, and you have to prove that he, had, in fact, moved to Portland, which he had, and so forth and so on. Each thing backs up to another thing, and that's why this is so difficult to prove for the most part. Not impossible, but again, it's not going to be the kind of proof most of the time. It's not going to be the kind of proof where somebody who really, really, really does not want it to be true is forced, they're forced to accept it because I show them something that they absolutely can't deny. And the truth is that people can deny anything. They can just look away, or lie to themselves. But I don't have very much of that kind of proof, a little bit. A few pieces here and there I can flat out prove. Like when Margaret Fuller, says that her birthday was in the middle of winter. Well, as a star, when the star says that his or her birthday was in the middle of winter, Margaret Fuller's birthday was not in the middle of winter. So you have these things, But anyway, I wanted to make it clear that Matthew had, in fact, told posterity that he was the star before Henry Ward Beecher ever started using it, and by inference, before Margaret Fuller ever started using it.